Chapter 1. A simple mistake with cosmic consequences. Ethan Drake never imagined that his casual decision to visit the Outer Rim colony of Volaris 9 would alter the course of his entire life. As a freelance pilot and engineer, he had spent years traveling from one system to another, picking up repair jobs, running cargo, and avoiding trouble whenever possible. He had heard rumors about the strange customs of some alien civilizations, but he had never been the type to dig too deep. So long as he got paid and avoided unnecessary conflict, that was enough for him. Volaris 9 was supposed to be just another job, a short contract to help repair an old jump relay station that had fallen into disrepair. The planetary governor had promised a hefty sum for someone skilled enough to get the relay back online, and since Ethan had nothing better to do, he had taken the job without much thought. The planet itself was a lush, warm world, covered in sprawling forests and crystalline lakes, its skies tinged with deep violet hues. It was home to the Zalari, an old and enigmatic species known for their strict social structures and rigid traditions. Unlike the sprawling megacities of other civilizations, the Zalari lived in vast communal estates, families bound by complex customs that outsiders rarely understood. Ethan had been warned to tread carefully while on Volaris 9. The Zalari took their traditions very seriously, and while they were not inherently hostile, they had little patience for those who ignored their customs. He had promised himself he would keep his head down, finish the job, and get off the planet without causing any issues. And yet one simple mistake was all it took to throw his entire life into chaos. The incident that started it all. The first few days on Volaris 9 had been uneventful, aside from the occasional language barrier issue and the frustratingly slow bureaucracy of the Zalari officials. Ethan spent most of his time in the relay station, buried under panels of exposed wiring, repairing circuits and calibrating the system's outdated controls. But on the fourth evening, everything changed. He had just finished his shift and was heading back toward the guest quarters assigned to off-world visitors when he took a wrong turn. The Zalari city he was stationed in was a labyrinth of interconnected structures, built in ways that did not conform to standard human architectural logic. Instead of reaching his room, he found himself wandering into a private courtyard, surrounded by high, ornate walls covered in golden inscriptions. Before he could turn back, he saw them. Two Zalari women, their long, iridescent hair flowing behind them, stood in the courtyard. They were tall, their lithe, elegant forms draped in flowing ceremonial robes of deep blue and silver, their features alien yet undeniably striking. Their skin shimmered faintly under the twin moons above, and their eyes large, violet, and filled with something he couldn't quite place locked onto him the moment he stepped forward. Ethan had only intended to apologize and back away, but before he could speak, one of them, the younger-looking of the two, stumbled slightly. Instinct kicked in, and without thinking, he reached out, catching her by the shoulders before she could fall. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, just long enough for him to steady her, for her to look up at him in wide-eyed surprise, for the other woman's expression to shift into something between shock and certainty. And then the bells rang. Deep, resonating chimes echoed across the courtyard, their tones reverberating in the air with an almost supernatural weight. The young woman he had touched gasped, her cheeks darkening with a deep, iridescent blush, and the older woman, her sister, stepped forward with a mixture of reverence and finality. "It is done," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something far greater than the situation warranted. Ethan blinked. "Wait, what?" The young woman stared at him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them over his. "You have chosen," she whispered, as if barely believing the words herself. His heart pounded. "I have absolutely no idea what's going on." The older woman's expression softened, but there was no hesitation in her words. "By the laws of our people, by the will of our ancestors and the bond you have now forged, you are bound to them." "Them?" Ethan echoed, his stomach twisting. The courtyard doors swung open, and a third woman entered. Tall, regal, her hair flowing like liquid silver, her robes adorned with intricate embroidery that denoted status, power, authority. But it was her eyes that caught him the most, piercing, knowing, and unshakably resolute. "Mother," the younger woman whispered, bowing her head. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "Mother?" The woman's gaze snapped to him, studying him with quiet intensity before she exhaled slowly. You touched my daughters. Ethan took a step back, his brain screaming at him to run, to fix this, to somehow explain that this was all a misunderstanding. But before he could even attempt to salvage the situation, she spoke again. There is no escape now. By the sacred laws of Volaris, 9, you are their husband. The weight of a choice he never made. For a long, agonizing moment, Ethan was sure he had misheard her. The word husband seemed too absurd, too impossible, too ridiculous to be real. But the expressions on their faces, the certainty in the mother's voice, the way the younger woman still hadn't let go of his hands, the way the bells were still ringing in the distance, all of it told him that this was no joke. He had just accidentally married into an alien royal family. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had barely touched her, hadn't even spoken to her before this moment, hadn't done anything that could be remotely considered a proposal. How could this possibly be binding? He turned to the older woman, the mother, their leader, their matriarch, whatever she was. There has to be a way to undo this. Her expression remained calm, but unyielding. Our traditions are absolute. The moment you laid hands upon my daughter, the bond was sealed. This is not something that can be undone. The younger woman, still clutching his hands, swallowed hard before whispering, I will accept this if you will. Ethan's mouth went dry. Accept this? Accept marrying two alien women in one accidental motion? He needed to wake up. This had to be a hallucination, some fever dream caused by exhaustion and alien food. But it wasn't. It was real. And no matter how much he wanted to argue, to refuse, to demand that someone explain how this ridiculous tradition made any sense, he knew deep down, instinctively, that he was already trapped. This was a mistake. But it was a mistake he might not be able to escape. Chapter 2. Trapped in tradition, bound by fate. Ethan stood frozen, his mind a battlefield between disbelief and sheer panic. The air around him felt heavy, the weight of expectation pressing down on his chest like an anchor. The younger woman, one of his supposed new wives, still held his hands, her grip uncertain but steady, her eyes flickering with emotions he could not begin to interpret. The older woman, their mother, their leader, their judge and executioner, all in one, watched him with the calm patience of someone who had already accepted what had happened long before he had even begun to process it. The bells still echoed in the distance, their deep chimes reverberating through the courtyard. And then, the doors shut behind him. Ethan turned his head sharply, his breath catching in his throat as he realized that he was locked inside. He turned back toward the matriarch, his voice sharper than he intended. This is a mistake. She did not react. It was an accident, he continued, trying to keep his voice even, to suppress the rising sense of helplessness clawing at his insides. I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't know. She lifted a hand, and his words died in his throat. Intent does not matter, she said, her tone measured, absolute. The bond was made. The tradition has been followed. The law is unyielding. Ethan clenched his jaw, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to find a way out of this. He turned toward the younger woman, the one he had actually touched. Do you want this? He asked, searching her face, hoping, praying for some kind of reluctance, some kind of mutual agreement that this was insane. She hesitated, just for a moment. And in that moment, he saw it. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of hesitation that told him she was just as lost in this as he was. But then, her sister, the other woman he had apparently been bound to, spoke up. This is our way, she said softly. To deny it would be to reject the will of our people. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the noose tighten around his neck. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. Negotiating with the unmovable. He had been led to a grand hall, a space filled with tapestries depicting Zalari history, symbols of their ancestors, and endless depictions of ceremonies much like the one he had just stumbled into. The very walls of the room seemed to reinforce the inevitability of his situation, as if centuries of tradition were physically pressing down on him, suffocating him. He sat on an ornate, gilded bench, his posture tense, his mind racing through every possible argument he could make. Across from him, the matriarch sat regally upon a raised seat, her expression unreadable. The two sisters stood beside her, their gazes lowered, their hands folded in front of them. Ethan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. He needed to approach this carefully. There must be an exception, he said, his voice steady but firm. A loophole. A way to dissolve this without disrupting your customs. The matriarch studied him for a long moment before she finally spoke. There is none. Ethan gritted his teeth. This isn't right, he pressed. I don't belong here. I don't even know them. The matriarch tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. And yet, you touched them. His hands curled into fists. By accident. The bond does not care for accidents, she replied. It is now written in the lineage of our people. Ethan's stomach twisted. Written? What does that mean? He asked carefully. The elder woman's eyes gleamed with something he could not place. It means that your name is now among the records of the Voluri's lineage. That your union has been acknowledged by our people. That your existence is now intertwined with theirs. His breath caught. This was worse than he thought. This wasn't just some fleeting cultural misunderstanding. This was something that had been recorded, formally recognized, permanently sealed into their history. And that meant walking away was not an option. Not unless he wanted to cause a political catastrophe. An impossible decision. He sat in his new quarters that night, staring at the walls, trying to process everything that had happened. The sisters Sayla and Avani, as he had learned their names to be, had been brought to the room as well, though they stood near the doorway, not speaking, not looking at him directly. The tension in the room was thick, an invisible wall separating them. He should not be here. This should not be happening. And yet it was. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. You don't have to go through with this. Sayla, the younger of the two, the one he had actually touched, finally looked at him, her violet eyes uncertain. But we must. Ethan frowned. Why? Avani spoke this time, her voice steady but laced with something deeper. Because our people would not accept it otherwise. And because we have been raised knowing that the bond is sacred. He shook his head. But I'm not Solari. I'm human. Our customs are different. Shouldn't that matter? Sayla hesitated. And then, she said something that shook him to his core. It does not matter what species you are. The bond has been made. And whether you believe in it or not, it will change you. Ethan stared at her. What do you mean, change me? Avani exhaled softly. The bond is not just ceremonial. It is binding, in more ways than one. The moment the bells rang, you became part of us. And the longer you resist it, the more it will pull at you. A slow, crawling realization settled over him like a shadow. This wasn't just a marriage in name. There was something more. Something deeper. Something he could already feel tugging at the edges of his mind, like an invisible thread weaving itself around his very existence. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure he could escape. Chapter 3. Bound by fate, pulled by the unknown. Ethan's mind raced through the possibilities, but every path he tried to take led to the same conclusion: he was caught in something far beyond his understanding. The Zolari weren't just tying him into their culture through law, they were binding him in a way that went deeper than any human custom could grasp. The very moment his hands had touched Sayla's, something had shifted, not just within their traditions, but within reality itself. And now, he was starting to feel it. At first, it had been subtle. A strange pull at the back of his mind, like a whisper he couldn't quite make out. Then, a heat in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he couldn't place, growing stronger the longer he was near them. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't simple emotion. It was something deeper. Something primal, something ancient. He had tried to sleep, but the sensation only intensified. His body felt unnaturally warm, his mind foggy with a tension that had no explanation. It was like a tether, an invisible link to something he had never agreed to be part of, but could not deny existed. And when he finally opened his eyes in the dim-lit chamber, Sayla and Avani were watching him. The unseen force between them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, his hands clenched into fists, his breath too shallow, his body humming with a force he did not understand. Sayla and Avani stood near the opposite wall, their expressions unreadable, their forms still too perfect, too unreal in the faint glow of the chamber's ambient lighting. It was Avani who finally broke the silence. "It has begun," she murmured. Ethan's pulse spiked. "What has?" Sayla shifted slightly, her hands pressing together in what seemed like nervous anticipation. The bond. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't even know what that means. Avani took a slow step forward, her gaze sharp. You feel it, don't you? His jaw tightened. I don't know what I feel. That wasn't entirely true, because now that he was paying attention, he could feel everything. The room felt too small, the air too thick, the space between them charged with an energy he couldn't begin to explain. It wasn't just tension. It was gravity, and it was pulling him toward them. Sayla swallowed visibly, glancing toward Avani before stepping forward herself, her movements hesitant but deliberate. This is what we meant, she said softly. The bond is not just tradition, not just law. It is something more. It is. She searched for the words, then exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. It is real. Ethan shook his head, standing abruptly, ignoring the way the sudden motion made the strange pull inside him surge. No, this can't be real. This is just Dash. But the moment he moved, so did they. It was instinctual, a reaction as natural as breathing, as if his movement had triggered a response in them, a shift in the invisible force that now linked them together. And when he stopped, they did too. Not out of caution, but because they had to. As if space itself no longer obeyed its usual rules between them. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. What the hell is this? Avani's gaze never wavered. You are bound to us, Ethan Drake. And we are bound to you. A connection that could not be denied. He tried to resist it. Tried to pretend that this was just another alien custom. Just another bureaucratic nightmare that he could escape with the right negotiation. But the truth was undeniable now. He could feel them. Not just see them, not just hear them but feel them. Sayla's hesitation, her uncertainty, echoed in the pit of his stomach. Avani's steady resolve, her confidence, hummed in the back of his mind. It was more than just an awareness of their presence. It was like his body, his very existence, had been tuned to them in a way he could not control. The longer he resisted it, the worse it got. At one point, he had tried to walk away from them, to test the limits of whatever this was. He had barely reached the corridor when a wave of nausea slammed into him, so hard his knees nearly buckled. And when he turned back, stumbling slightly, gasping for breath, they were there, waiting, watching, as if they had known, because they had felt it too. He had never believed in fate, in destiny, in things beyond the grasp of science and logic. But this was something he could not explain, and he was beginning to wonder if he was already too late to fight it. The truth of the bond. Days passed, or maybe hours. He wasn't sure anymore. Time was losing meaning. The bond had begun to affect him in ways he hadn't expected. His emotions weren't entirely his own anymore. Flashes of feelings that didn't belong to him stirred in his chest at random moments. Sayla's hesitation, Avani's determination, their awareness of him, as strong as his awareness of them. It was an invasion he should have been angry about. But the worst part was it wasn't. Because it wasn't just them inside him. He was inside them. He could feel their hesitation, their own battle with what was happening, their own struggles to understand the depth of what this bond truly meant. And the moment he realized that, he understood. They were as trapped as he was. This wasn't just forced upon him. It had been forced upon them too. And for the first time, he stopped fighting. The moment that changed everything. That night, he didn't try to escape, didn't try to argue, didn't try to deny the truth. Instead, he stood before them, truly seeing them, truly understanding them for the first time. Sayla was uncertain, but hopeful. Avani was strong, but cautious. And he was somewhere in between. We never wanted this forced upon you, Sayla admitted, her voice quiet but honest. But we cannot change what has already happened. Avani nodded. We do not ask you to accept us because of obligation. But the bond is real, Ethan Drake. And if you allow it, it will show you what it truly means. He exhaled, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. Then, without thinking, he reached out. Not because of duty, not because of law, but because, for the first time, he wanted to. And as his fingers brushed against theirs, the bond pulsed. Stronger than before. Undeniable. Irrevocable. And Ethan Drake finally understood. He was theirs, and they were his. Chapter 4. No escape, no regrets. Ethan had spent his entire life believing in his own choices, his own freedom, his own path. He had always been the kind of man who could walk away when things got complicated, who could turn his back on trouble before it swallowed him whole. But now, for the first time, he was facing something that would not let him go. The bond was not just a law, not just a tradition, not just an expectation. It was a force of nature, a living, breathing connection that had been woven into the very fabric of his being, into his thoughts, his senses, his emotions. He could feel them Sayla and Avani like a second heartbeat inside his chest. Every hesitation, every breath, every fleeting thought they had brushed against his mind like whispers on the wind. It was terrifying. It was unfair. But worst of all, it was real. And there was no going back. Acceptance or surrender. Ethan sat in the quiet chamber, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slow, measured. Sayla and Avani stood nearby, their violet eyes unreadable, their forms as still as statues. The air between them was thick, charged with the weight of everything unsaid. He had spent days, or had it been weeks now, trying to fight this, trying to deny it. But the truth had settled inside him like a stone in his chest. The moment he had touched Sayla, the choice had been made for him. And now, he had only two options. He could keep resisting, keep pretending he had any real control left. Or he could accept what had already been written in the stars. He exhaled slowly, lifting his gaze to theirs. Tell me what it means. Avani tilted her head slightly, studying him with the sharp focus of a warrior assessing a battlefield. You are already beginning to understand, aren't you? He swallowed, nodding. The bond. It's not just ceremonial. Sayla stepped forward, her hands tightening at her sides. It is deeper than blood, deeper than words, deeper than anything your people have known. Ethan rubbed his temple, his mind still trying to grasp the enormity of it all. It connects us. Avani nodded. Yes, and the longer it exists, the stronger it becomes. He closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel it already. Not just a mental connection, not just some mystical energy binding them together. It was something else entirely. It was pulling him toward them, anchoring him to them in a way he could not explain. And for the first time, he wondered, had he really been fighting them? Or had he been fighting himself? A test of the bond. The following night, the matriarch called for him. He was led into a grand ceremonial hall, its walls lined with ancient symbols, its floor polished obsidian, reflecting the deep violet glow of the overhead lanterns. The entire space felt heavy with history, with power, with something far older than the war-torn galaxies he had traveled through. At the center of the chamber stood the matriarch, regal and unshaken, her gaze piercing through him like she could see every thought before he even spoke it. Sayla and Avani stood beside her, their expressions unreadable. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. Why am I here? The matriarch studied him in silence before finally speaking. You have resisted the bond, fought against what has already been set into motion. He said nothing, because she was right. But the bond does not care for hesitation, she continued, her voice low and firm. It will either claim you, or it will break you. His stomach twisted. Break me? The matriarch stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. There has never been a time in our history when a bonded mate has refused what was given. But if you continue to resist, the bond will tear itself apart. And in doing so, it will take you with it. A silence heavier than any battle he had fought and settled over the room. Ethan's pulse quickened. What happens if I accept it? Sayla's voice was quiet but sure. Then you will become one with us. His breath hitched. And what does that mean? Avani took a step forward this time, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It means you will never be alone again. The final choice. He could feel it now, pressing against him from all sides, as if the bond itself was waiting for him to decide. Would he keep fighting? Would he keep running? Or would he finally embrace what had already claimed him? His heart pounded as he stepped forward, locking eyes with Sayla first, then Avani. Then show me, he whispered. Avani inhaled slowly, then reached for his hand. The moment their fingers touched, everything changed. A rush of heat, of sensation, of something beyond thought, beyond words, beyond time itself, surged through him. He gasped, feeling everything at once, the weight of their emotions, their fears, their hopes, their certainty that this was meant to be. Sayla reached for him next, her hand pressing gently against his chest, and the moment she made contact, the bond snapped fully into place. He could see through their eyes, hear through their thoughts, feel through their very souls. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. And yet it was right. He wasn't being forced. Not anymore. This was his choice now. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around theirs. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I'm not going anywhere. A new future. The days that followed were unlike anything he had ever known. He was no longer just Ethan Drake, the wanderer, the freelancer, the man who had once been free to leave whenever he pleased. Now, he was bound. Not as a prisoner. Not as a trophy. But as something more. The bond was stronger than ever, tying their very existence together. He could feel them in ways he never thought possible, and they could feel him. And the strangest part? He didn't want to fight it anymore. For the first time in his life, he belonged somewhere. With them. By their side. And when he looked at Sayla and Avani now, he no longer saw an accident. He saw his future. His home. His family. And he would never run again.